This is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners in cooperation with Prophecy DeFi. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the DeFi Decoded podcast. I am Alex Tapscott here with co-host Andrew Young. It is Tuesday, January 3rd, the time of recording. Happy New Year to everyone. We think 2023 is going to be an eventful year. Is there any other kind in the world of crypto and Web3? Today, we're going to walk through some of Andrew's predictions for what is to come. And then next week, we're going to discuss some of my predictions as well, and assuming that there are none that are there anything new to say after what Andrew has added. But first, Andrew, before we get into that, I want to touch base and talk just about one thing, which is that you right now are on a field trip, are you not, to the Bahamas? There have been a few crypto influencers who have traveled down to the Bahamas to report back on the situation with FTX and Sam Bankamn Fried. And I know you've got something special to share with us. So please, by all means, go ahead.
Yeah, so I have some breaking news, which is that Sam is not in the Bahamas anymore. He seems to be back in New York and has just pled not guilty to all of his charges.
Wait, and he's not in the Bahamas?
He is no longer in the Bahamas as of a month ago, apparently. So
Wow,
this trip has been
amazing.
Purely vacation.
Well, it's a good thing that that we got this key information, because the DeFi Decoded podcast did pay $20,000 to fly you down there and put you up in 5-star lodgings to come back with this key report. So we really appreciate it. Okay, moving on to new topics. Solana is a name that actually last year did worse than FTT tokens. Shockingly, it's a layer one asset that we've discussed at length on this podcast. It's been dubbed by a lot of boosters as a so-called Ethereum killer, because it solves some of the issues prevalent in the trilemma, which we've also discussed, this idea that you've got to make trade-offs when building and scaling blockchain networks. But it seems to me that right now, the future of Solana is in doubt. The asset's value is collapsed, as we've described, and there's also some anecdotal reports that a lot of developers and other sort of key backers have stepped away, which is probably not surprising for a technology that doubles as an asset class. If you find yourself down, 90-95% on something, you may decide to wrap it up and try something else. So, we have a view on Solana. We think it's really interesting. We've talked to Anatoly Yakovenko this past year on the subject. He's one of the founders, and it seems like they're doing stuff that's really interesting, but I'd love to get your take on this. Is it possible for the price of an asset to go down so much that it collapses an ecosystem? How does that work?
It's definitely possible in a proof of stake based system, actually, or a proof of work system. If the price of the asset falls enough, it can just be continuously 51% attacked. And so the price of the asset and the liquidity of the asset are sort of directly related to the security of the network. So if the price falls low enough, that hurts the security, which then makes it if you're a dApp developer, it makes you want to move off that ecosystem, because the sort of fundamental security of the chain is no longer guaranteed. And Solana was initially a huge beneficiary of sort of positive feedback cycle, where FTX, as well as Sam Bankamn Fried and just a number of different VCs sort of pumped capital into Solana. The TVL soared from sort of under 100 million to over $10 billion almost exactly a year ago, about 14 months ago.
Yeah.
And I believe at one point was, I think, either second or third in total TVL, as well as just total number of applications on the chain. And so that, like you said, led to it being kind of the number one potential Ethereum killer. And then now it's just been the exact opposite over the last 14 months. The price of Sol has fallen from $250 to at one point below $10. And correspondingly, the TVL of Solana has fallen from a peak of $10 billion to now $225 million. And it's actually outside of the top 10 It's below chains that pretty much, or very few people have heard of, things like Mixin and I mean, people have heard of Phantom, but it's a much sort of smaller ecosystem, or at least historically has been. And so Solana has really sort of fallen off a cliff, really.
Right.
But what's interesting though is, and you're also starting to see some NFT projects move as well. The biggest one was DGods, which was, I believe, one of the biggest, if not biggest, sort of NFT projects on Solana. It announced that it was moving, or at least partly moving, to Ethereum and Polygon. Phantom, which was a sort of custom designed Solana wallet, announced it's going to be having multi-chain support, so sort of moving away from Solana. And then obviously, just like the last 2 months with the whole FTX situation, has just exacerbated it. And then now there's been reports essentially showing that a lot of the TVL that drove Solana last year, a lot of it was actually sort of recycled through SPF and FTX itself.
Right.
And they were at one point buying, I've seen reports, they're buying like 40 to 50% of the NFTs of certain projects. So really supporting the ecosystem. So the fact that that support is gone, combined with the collapsing price of Sol has really hurt the ecosystem. But one thing that is interesting is, just without sort of going on too long, but Ethereum went through something sort of similar in 2018 and 2019, where the price of Ethereum went from over $1,400 down to $80. At the time, we didn't really have measures of TVL, so it was hard to sort of quantify the impact in terms of fundamentals. But it really washed out all of the sort of low quality founders and sort of, maybe not scammers, but sort of very low quality projects all died out.
Right.
And in a way, the washout was necessary to sort of weed the ecosystem of low quality projects and just sort of bad natured founders and things like that, and set the stage for its renewal, and sort of the DeFi spring, which happened in spring of 2020. So
Right.
There's sort of two ways you can look at it. The short-term way is just clearly, like, objectively negative for Solana, just in terms of headline metrics and things like that.
Yeah.
But taking sort of a longer-term view, this could be very positive. And the best way to sort of build a community is to go through something somewhat traumatic like this.
Right.
So I guess short-term bad news, long-term potentially good news.
Yeah. Well, it's a question of whether the medicine will kill the patient. I mean, if it ends up, never recovering and is subject to attacks, then it'll be difficult for them to regain the confidence of new developers and also to keep the high quality ones on board. But I think your point is a valid one. One difference between Ethereum in 2018, 19 and Solana today is that there was definitely a lot of hot money in Ether projects. The ICO craze were all pretty much ERC20 tokens. And so there was sort of a lot of innate demand for, block space and for the asset in those days. But it wasn't VC backed, or if not VC backed, like backed by large strategic players who were kind of pumping and dumping. I don't think. I mean, certainly there were people in the ecosystem. I can't say that with 100% certainty, obviously, but this is the kind of thing where the rise in Solana TVL and the transaction volumes in the NFTs, at least the way you've described it, seems engineered by one group to create the illusion of value creation or the illusion of volume when maybe not as much of that existed at the time, right? And so to me, that seems like a bigger knock against it, or at least a bigger obstacle that needs to be overcome, because you take that out and all of a sudden it's not just that you have seen the exit of a bunch of hot money founders and scammers and so forth, but you're actually dealing with this huge gap where there used to be a backstop for the market. And I mean, obviously we've seen what the collapse of the asset is sort of proof point number one of that. Okay, but that's still very interesting. Yeah, I mean,
And
people
what
are saying is Solana's $8 moment, Ethereum's $80 moment, right? Which is like, I remember December of 2018, when the price just was like falling through the floor and everyone thought it was going to zero. I mean, it's hard to imagine now, given I think how comfortable everyone is with Ethereum and what it does and what it represents, but that was not so long ago, right? So yeah, maybe it's a generational buying opportunity, but we're certainly not recommending that because we don't make recommendations.
Yeah. And one thing I would also difference that a lot of people have pointed out, back then for good quality sort of projects, Ethereum was really the only game in town.
Right.
Like back then, if you looked at something like Dab Radar, or I guess DeFi Llama didn't even exist, but the only other chains were EOS and Tron, which for the most part had very negative perceptions around them, that to the point that not many founders were really looking at them as a potential alternative.
Yeah.
So it was different because for Ethereum, it was mostly just washing out low quality founders and projects, things that were never really going to add that much value, but mostly just extracting value. Yep. Whereas with Solana, they are losing projects that do add value. It's just the fact that they're able to go to other chains.
So that is do you have examples of that, Andrew? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So the project I gave as an example was DGods, which is an NFT project.
Yeah.
They announced that they were bridging their collection over to one collection to Ethereum and then another collection to Polygon.
Right.
And sort of also said that they were going to be launching future things on Ethereum mostly, I believe. And so that is a project that isn't sort of a low quality project. It's a very high quality project. I mean, one of the sort of the top NFT projects. Mm-hmm. So for them to sort of announce that they're moving away from Solana was a huge blow. It's definitely different than kind of like a scammy ICO announcing in 2018 that they were just
shutting down.
Shutting down. So yeah, it's definitely a different situation, but one thing that is interesting, the projects that are staying on Solana are the projects that can't go anywhere else. And so what I mean by that is there are projects that are building, for example, decentralized order books, because Solana has one of the best sort of architectures for that, right, for that use case. And so what's likely going to happen is, I guess in a way, Solana will probably lose projects that could build on other chains, but the core projects that can only build on Solana's architecture, by their very definition, cannot leave and will not leave.
All right. Well, it's something we'll be following closely. So the topic of today's episode was your predictions for 2023. Obviously, all that sun and cold beer has helped to stimulate your mind. And I know you've got some good ideas. So hit us with what your top predictions are for 2023. Bring it on. Number one.
Yeah, well, I think number one, I mean, I've been beating the drum on this a lot, but I think number one is a flight to quality. So what I mean by quality is projects that have protocol revenue in excess of token incentives. They will likely outperform. And I know we don't give predictions, so I'll just say on a fundamental basis, they will outperform. Whereas projects that have historically relied heavily on token incentives without hitting product market fit, they are going to struggle quite a bit to retain TVL and retain users. And the thing about TVL is it's highly, going back to that positive feedback loop, it benefits a lot from sort of positive feedback loops. So if people are no longer using these projects, TVL will leave, which then makes it worse, like a worse product experience for users, which leads to more TVL fleeing. At the same time, the token obviously would be going down, which lowers the amount of token incentives that they can offer to get TVL. You're sort of seeing this play out right now with Sushi. And Sushi Swap, I'm not totally sure what's going to happen with Sushi. I think Sushi actually has a good enough brand, unlike a lot of other projects, that it'll be able to survive this sort of feedback loop. But Sushi essentially is redirecting all of its protocol revenue away from ex sushi holders. So these are essentially people who've staked sushi, and redirecting it into a treasury in order to fund the core team, as well as sort of fund token incentives and things like that. So they're trying to get ahead of it by taking sort of, I guess, what would be more of a long-term view. But most projects, I don't think, have even sufficient revenue to be able to do this, and will likely just sort of slowly die away.
Right. So can we talk about this, a couple of these metrics that you just used, protocol revenue and token incentives? So token incentives, is it correct to think of that as sort of like dilution or like an inflation rate effectively for a token? And then protocol revenue is, earnings. It's almost like a buy, not that it's used for buybacks, but the idea that, even if like a company, I'm just trying to think for our more mainstream audience, who, if there are any of you left, if you're a business that issues stock, right? Could be dilutive, but if you issue stock to do something that is accretive to your earnings per share, like you go, buy another company, or you use that money to build some useful asset, then it actually like increases the value of the business in the long term, right? So is that sort of a similar kind of metric or sort of comparison to use?
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly the right way to think about it. For crypto protocols and DeFi protocols, network effects are everything.
Yeah.
And typically the main network effect is liquidity itself. So the more liquidity you get, the better the product is for users, which then obviously makes the product better, which adds more users to the site, and sort of it's a like typical flywheel effect. And so the big innovation of DeFi and crypto, or I should say one of the big innovations, was rather than selling equity to VCs in order to try to subsidize growth and get that network flywheel effect going, they just issue tokens directly to users of the site,
right?
Which is even better because it's not a short-term sort of subsidy incentive. It can be a long-term sort of ownership in the protocol, which builds, in my opinion, more of an emotional connection and sort of is better for retention long-term. But the problem there is that you're constantly issuing tokens, and so you're more beholden to short-term market forces. And that's a big issue right now for a lot of DeFi projects.
Well, not only that, isn't that there's a separate issue, which is that in the early days, the token incentives might be really robust, and that drives a lot of mercenary like people who are coming in to extract as much value as they can. But as the project matures, I mean, you cannot double the number of tokens outstanding every year and expect the token to retain any value. I mean, companies have been trying to do that. Currency issuers have tried to do that. Eventually, it comes up to it, catches up with you. So, the question of ownership as one of the user experience benefits, like the read, write, own web, it's very powerful, but you've got to, it's almost like you got to be get your tokenomics right from the get-go, and then B, have a product that's useful and people want to use that, and maybe token ownership is an incentive, but the thing has to be able to stand almost on its own without that, right? And I just think that so much of DeFi in this first early wave has been projects that have been trying to, grab liquidity and users from other DeFi protocols by just offering more insane incentive rewards. And that's when we got to the gazillion% inflation that I think has, been one of the reasons that's kind of undermined confidence in it, frankly. So
yeah. And just to add to that point, the problem is, so protocol revenue is essentially the amount of revenue that the protocol generates that is able to be directed to token holders or core team funding, so anything like that. And the problem, there's two problems. One is a lot of DeFi protocols had zero protocol revenue.
right.
And huge token incentives. So that's just obviously not sustainable. The only real example of that working so far is Uniswap, because they just have such a dominant brand within the decentralized exchange space, and sort of enough funding to make it work. But a lot of people are sort of looking to the day where they turn on protocol revenue as like a huge catalyst. So that's Uniswap's like the one main exception there. But then there's a ton of other projects that do have protocol revenue, but the amount that's being issued in token incentives just far outweighs the revenue, sometimes sort of 10, 20x. And those projects are essentially have massive negative protocol net income, which is actually something that people, for some reason, protocol net income is not something that has been talked about very much, which is kind of interesting. But essentially, it's just taking protocol revenue and minusing out token incentives.
Yeah.
And for the most part, there's very few projects that have positive protocol net income. If you look at Token Terminal, it looks like there's actually less than 20. And Ethereum itself is sort of the best example of this. And it's not actually always there. I should say it is now, actually, after the proof of stake. But and that's again why I think projects like Ethereum are going to, on a relative scale, sort of dominate the next year, just because I feel very strongly that Ethereum will still be here a year from now,
Right.
and still
I mean, yeah,
still capturing value.
So you got three tiers: big incentives, no revenue, number one; number two, big incentives, some revenue; and then number three, where revenue is greater than incentives, right? And what's interesting about these three tiers is that number one, big incentive, no revenue, this isn't really comparable to Web 2, but there is sort of an argument that a lot of Web 2 businesses scaled, their model was to grab as many users as possible to achieve the biggest network effect in their domain, and then to sort of add revenue or profit later on, right? Like Facebook famously did not make any money for many years. And only later, once it had gotten to sort of critical mass, did it turn on the spigot. In that case, it was advertising, not some other form of revenue. But it seems to me that the barriers for what you said is the liquidity is the network effect, because liquidity is so composable in a way, like it can be moved around. Offering a big incentive up front to drive users is not necessarily a good strategy, if anything, because it can be easily transferred over, right? It can be migrated over. So it's not quite the same. Like Web3 is more open than Web 2 in that respect. So it's an interesting analysis. I wonder, is there a list of all the tier 3 companies where revenue is greater than incentives? Like, where does that exist anywhere, Andrew?
Yeah, so Token Terminal does, in my opinion, does a phenomenal job at this. I think that, at least, I think if there's any others, I don't think there actually is any other sites. Like maybe there is, maybe someone can correct me, but Token Terminal is like by far and away the best. It shows protocol revenue. It also breaks out supply side revenue, which I don't think should be called supply side revenue, but essentially that's the amount of revenue that the supply side of any of these protocols earns. So for like something like Uniswap, that would be the amount of trading fees they generate. I use that. I think more and more people are going to be using that. And that actually comes to my second main prediction of 2023, which may be more of like a second half of 2023 and 24, which is, if you think of the cycles in crypto, the last cycle we had an explosion of new projects, an explosion of new projects. Like this is a 2017 cycle, an explosion of projects and funding, and only a small percentage of those actually launch projects or products at all. There was a ton of vaporware, like probably over 80-90%. Whereas the most recent cycle, we sort of graduated past the vaporware stage to the vast majority of projects had products,
right?
But only a very small percentage generated protocol net income or even protocol revenue. I think the next cycle is going to be sort of everyone is going to be generating protocol revenue, and a number are going to be generating protocol net income. But it's going to be defined by network defensibility and network effects around that protocol revenue. And so I think that is going to be the big thing. Whereas everyone on this cycle is starting to look at protocol net income, what I think people are going to be looking towards in the next cycle is defensibility.
It's interesting. Yeah.
And that
trying to think.
that also and that also sort of fits into my, we'll call it my prediction 2B, or even the third prediction, which is, I mean, I've been hammering this nonstop, which is application specific chains.
Yeah.
Because I think one way to lock in network effects and defensibility, as well as liquidity, is by vertically integrating and building your own sort of base layer chains. And so I think that's going to be the thing that people are going to be doing more and more of. You're going to see some really, really cool innovation on the DeFi side. I think also in the video game side, and things like that. So I think that's going to be, you can kind of think of those as three predictions in one, I guess, but that's kind of my core, that forms the core thesis of what I think the next kind of year to 2 years is going to look like. I have some other smaller predictions as well, but that's kind of the core thesis, I guess.
Well, the idea that as the technology progresses and becomes more useful, that the applications become more useful, and that they develop a model that's more sustainable, I think is sort of logically sound. The fact that we have tokens as a way to incentivize user growth and as a way to, secure a network as an incentive, I just find that people kind of went bonkers with it and tried a zillion different models, and a lot of those models failed spectacularly. I mean, that's true not only in DeFi, but also in the gaming space. The Axie Infinity example is a good one there. But it doesn't necessarily, you can ascribe like bad intent to people, right? You can say, oh, well, this was a sort of they unsustainable from the start and they knew it was all going to go sideways. Or you can just say like, this is the tabula rasa, we're dealing with like an unknown world and we're just kind of like groping at opportunities and solutions as we find them. And so I generally tend to fall into the latter category, and I do agree with you that like the next tier of companies or next generation of projects, I should say, will embrace those kinds of principles as you've described them. All right, we've got a couple more minutes here. So we got prediction number 1, flight to quality. Prediction number 2, everyone's going to have protocol revenue. Prediction number 3, there will be more projects choosing to choose their own destiny by launching app chains. What else you got?
Yeah, so I should clarify. Prediction number 2 is protocol revenue will be standard, and the next thing people are going to be looking to the future will be defensibility. That will be sort of what.
Got
yeah.
it.
So protocol revenue will become standard, and if not sort of minimum requirement, table stake stuff. Yeah. I think one thing, and then like you said, prediction number 3 is about application specific chains. I think the next sort of smaller prediction, I mean, I have a lot less conviction in this because it's not really the space I operate in, but I think there's going to be some really cool and actually fun blockchain video games.
Yeah.
So, I mean, this is actually something you probably know more about, but the wave of blockchain video games that came out sort of in the most recent cycle were pretty underwhelming for the most part, I would say. And they relied way too much on sort of token incentives to get users, which was great. I mean, video games have network effects as well, right? So it's just, instead of liquidity, it's sort of player count, at least for certain games. And so we sort of showed that we could do play to earn in this most recent cycle, but I'm really looking forward to like more fun games, like first person shooter games, things like that, with token incentives attached. I'm not totally sure what this will look like, but I do think it's likely, because play to earn sort of caught everyone off guard. Now I think there are video game production studios that know that there's an opportunity here, that have experience building games that can stand on their own. So I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, play to earn is a classic case where that term should die out, because it's not really what we're talking about. It's not play to earn, or at least it shouldn't be. It's more like play and own, right? It's basically just the idea that like, if you're going to be spending a lot of time doing something and you're going to be spending money which people do already in freemium model video games, which represent 60% of the whole gaming market in terms of total revenue, then they might as well actually own the assets and have like an economic stake in the outcome of what happens in these environments and in these worlds. Like that to me just does never, it's always seemed like just like the most logical thing ever. Like according to recent data, people spent $100 billion in 2021 on virtual goods, which isn't just assets in video games. It's all manner of things that we rent online. But it's like people are already used to buying. They just don't like to own. It's like, why do we buy, but we don't own? So now we can just own, right? So models where the ownership is a feature of the gameplay, I think is really cool, right? Models where earning to own is the only thing you're supposed to be doing, I think are going to flame out. And I think that's fine. That's like how it should be. By the way, for those of you who are listening, we did a great discussion with Ben Lee of Blowfish Studios 9 months ago, I think, Andrew, where he was talking a lot about this. I actually revisited, I had some of our episodes transcribed for a research report that I'm working on for 9Point, and I was able to revisit that. There's some really great insights on this idea in that discussion. So for those of you who are listening in, do go back to the archives and check that one out. All right, Andrew, that was an awesome discussion. Great predictions, really thoughtful stuff. A lot of these I haven't heard from anyone else yet. I love the idea of defensibility being the next thing that people are going to look for, but also that protocol revenue may become the norm after this period of hyperinflation kind of has flamed out. And I think that that's almost weirdly in keeping with the original sort of thesis of blockchains in general, right? Which is that they're not that all apps and tokens should be sound money or anything like that, but the idea that that the supply of something is constrained by rational economics, I think is kind of interesting.
I have one last prediction also.
Yeah, what do you got?
Is that Digital Asset Revolution will become a bestseller. I bought a couple copies and have been giving them out, and
Yes.
read it over the weekend, and it was some great beach reading.
Well, there's a really excellent deep dive into how prediction markets will transform our world by an esteemed author who everyone should check out if they haven't already. His name is Andrew Young. He is someone who has deep insight into this and other areas in Web3, as I think we all know from this podcast. Andrew, thanks for carrying the weight on this one. You came in hot and with some great stuff, and that was awesome. So thank you. We'll see everybody next week. I'm going to come up with some of my own predictions, I guess, for this coming year. And then we've got a great slate of guests teed up for the next little while. So make sure to tune in to DeFi Decoded. That's it. Happy New Year again to everyone, and we will see you next week. Take care, Andrew.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.